Great. Well, so I want to talk to you this afternoon about the alt-right, but really through the lens of an intellectual historian. I don't specialize on the alt-right. It's not something that I've written about in any kind of published way, but I am, as Brian mentioned, writing an intellectual history of libertarianism and classical liberal ideas. And in writing that history, I came across accounts and stories and writings from people on the other side of the debate from the classical liberals that I see as, in many ways, precursors to today's alt-right. So what I want to do is start with today's alt-right, but then trace it back and show a little bit about where those ideas come from. It's a complicated movement. The ideas have multiple sources. I'm just going to be taking one strand of this history and kind of pulling on it a little bit and seeing where it goes. So this is the face that you all know of today's alt-right. This is Richard Spencer, who is a self-described white nationalist. And these are some of the ideas that he and the alt-right movement more generally stands for. Right? So the alt-right is a quite populist movement. They view themselves as being of the people and standing up against the elite, right, that they feel have co-opted the system from them. They've taken it from them. They're a nationalist movement, so Spencer is a white nationalist in particular, but as opposed to, say, a cosmopolitan movement, they see the closing of American borders to international trade, to international migration, as a desirable direction for public policy to move in. Isolationist, kind of just another way of saying the same thing. They're a white supremacist movement, so they believe in the supremacy of the white race and want to purify the white race, both kind of geographically and genetically from mixture by other races. And they're, of course, a strongly anti-feminist movement as well. So they're inegalitarian in several different respects, both racially and sexually. They believe that white males are superior to both women and non-white males. Brief overview of the alt-right. I imagine most of that's familiar to you. Where do those ideas come from? Well, there's some points of connection to modern conservatism, the actual right. So the alt-right is the alternative right, an alternative to mainstream conservatism. There are some points of connection between the alt-right and the more traditional right. Both the right and the alt-right place an emphasis on the idea of social order, right? As opposed to other things that you could think would be important in a society for us to aim for, like equality or freedom. Various social movements at various points in history has held up one of these ideas as kind of the end that we should be striving for in our social organization. Conservatism tends to put the emphasis on social order above either equality or liberty or some other value. And there are certainly strands of populism and isolationism and nationalism in contemporary conservatism as well, especially, of course, in today's version of conservatism that we find in the age of Trump, right? When you have someone like Steve Bannon working in the White House, the distinctions between the alt-right and the mainstream right become a little blurred. But there are some other aspects of contemporary conservatism that the alt-right decisively rejects. So, for instance, there's a strand in contemporary conservatism that puts a great deal of emphasis on the individual, on the idea of individual freedom, on the idea of individual responsibility, and the alt-right, whatever else it might be, is not terribly individualistic. They're nationalistic, they put the emphasis on the nation. They're racist, they put the emphasis on the race, rather than putting the emphasis on the individual. What's important is the purity and future of the race, the security and order of the nation, and if individuals have to be sacrificed for the betterment of those larger social organisms, that's something that many people in the alt-right are comfortable with. They also pretty strongly reject the strand of laissez-faire economics that you find in conservatism as well. And again, this is just a strand of contemporary conservatism, but there is an important strand of conservative thought that holds that the free market, free from government regulation, free from government monopolies over certain industries, is an important, perhaps a primarily important social value. And that's something that you really don't see at all in the alt-right. Richard Spencer's recently come out, for instance, and talked about the importance of a national health care system, for instance, as protecting the white race. So he rejects that element of it. Of course, he rejects the free trade element between nations, free trade between nations element of laissez-faire economics. So there's connections between the alt-right and the mainstream right, but there's also some sharp points of divergence. So what I want to do in the remainder of this talk is trace back from the contemporary alt-right to some of its precursors and see where some of these divisions originated, because I think the divisions are in some ways clearer in the earlier historical figures than they are in the contemporary manifestations that we see before us today. So here's somebody that might not be as familiar to many of you as that first picture I showed you. Have any of you seen or heard of this guy before? A couple of you. Tim, good for you. Well, I'm not sure good for you is the right phrase here. This is Curtis Yarvin. He's a computer programmer, come political philosopher from Silicon Valley who wrote under the name of Mencius Moldbug for quite some time. Writes these long, have you read his stuff? Very long essays that sort of blend pop political philosophy with historiography, with evolutionary biology, to make the case for what others have called the dark Enlightenment worldview. That was a phrase that came from another guy in the movement, Nick Land, I believe, who was a British expat continental philosopher. The Dark Enlightenment is also called the neo-reactionary movement by some. This is a movement that started manifesting itself in the early 2000s on the internet mostly, through blogs and various forums online. And for a long time languished in obscurity, in well-deserved obscurity, one might say. The guy's a really poor writer. But around 2012, it started to gain quite a bit of attention. And there are stories in TechCrunch and the New Republic and the Times of London about this dark Enlightenment phenomenon and its ties to what was then in its very early nascent stages, the alt-right. So here are the names of some of the fellows in this movement. Most of them are fairly obscure. Nick Land, as I said, is a philosopher. Anisimov is a monarchist transhumanist who's written some fairly interesting pieces online as well. And Bryce Lalibert is a Catholic anarchist figure. So it's an eclectic mix of folks. But what I think you can characterize this movement as a whole is it's sort of the philosophical precursor to the contemporary alt-right, which is a much less thoughtful movement and a movement more focused on political activism, staging rallies, yelling at people, getting in people's faces. These people mostly wrote blog posts. They weren't marching in the streets or doing anything of the activist sort. What are some of the ideas of the Dark Enlightenment? Well, some of them are familiar from the alt-right. So there's, again, a very heavy strand of anti-egalitarianism within this movement that manifests itself in a number of different ways. So like the alt-right, they're anti-feminist, but there's a more developed worldview here about the importance of traditional sex roles to preserving society. Generally, these arguments for traditional sex roles are couched in sort of evolutionary biological terms rather than purely traditionalist appeals to this is the way it's been done. So there are arguments that for various biological reasons, men are fit to perform certain kinds of tasks, women are fit to perform other kinds of tasks, and society works better if everybody sticks to the role that they're fit in. There's a belief in a natural aristocracy, as they sometimes call it, meaning that essentially some people are just better than others, and the people who are just better than others should be allowed to rule, and the people who aren't as good should obey the people who are better than them. And then again, society will work better if that natural order of merit is respected. And in cashing out that natural aristocracy, that idea of natural aristocracy, there's a very, very strong emphasis on IQ. So if you look at the online discussions involving these dark Enlightenment figures, and you see this to a certain extent in the alt-right still today. There's a lot of talk about IQ and how important IQ is as a determinant of everything, right? Like IQ is the most important characteristic about you, and it's heavily, heavily genetically determined, according to the dark Enlightenment figures. So there are low IQ people, there are high IQ people, and in the natural order of the world, the high IQ people rule. Partly in virtue of this anti-egalitarianism, as a kind of descriptive fact about the way people are, there's also a kind of anti-egalitarianism when it comes to political philosophy, so they're profoundly anti-democratic. They think that democratic rule is about the worst form of rule that one could have in a society, because it's ruled by everybody, right? Including all those low IQ people. They get just as much of a vote as the high IQ people. Why on earth would you do that? Say the dark Enlightenment figures. Why not put the best on top? And a staggeringly high number of these people are monarchists of some sort. They're sort of monarchist restorationists. So they want a new form of monarchy. Curtis Yarvin, the founder of this, has some kind of weird version of monarchy where he envisions the king as being the CEO of a kind of joint stock company in the United States, where the aristocrats are kind of like the board of directors. So it's new take on an old idea. And then finally, another thing you see a lot when you're looking at dark Enlightenment writings is this idea of the cathedral, and there's strong opposition to the cathedral. And what they mean by the cathedral is essentially the elite, right? So it's the government, business, media, university elites, the people who run society and shape its values and determine what is acceptable to talk about, what's going to constitute success in society, who's going to get promoted up the ladder and who's going to get kept down. The dark Enlightenment thinkers believe that it's kind of an interesting mix, right? Because that's a very populist idea, right? Like there's this small cadre of individuals who are running society, but then you have this weird combination of populism and elitism, right, at the same time. And the way those two things get put together is that the dark Enlightenment figures say there's a distinction between the natural elite and the artificial elite, right? So the natural elite are the high IQ people, the smart people, the natural aristocracy who are gifted and talented and able to run society. And then there's this kind of artificial elite, these people who aren't really that good, but because of the way we've set society up, they happen to be the one in charge right now. And that lets them tell this very convenient persecution story, right, about how these poor white males who really ought to be running everything have been kept out of power by the cathedral and prevented from running the world according to their genius ideas about monarchy. So it's a strange story, and it's delved into in great length in the works of Curtis Yarvin, if you would like to explore them further. But that's probably far enough as far as we go. So now I want to take things back just one more step. Right, so where did these dark Enlightenment ideas come from? And this is the last step in my journey. I want to go back to the 19th century here and talk a little bit about Thomas Carlyle. And this isn't purely conjecture on my part. I think there are obvious connections between the things that the dark Enlightenment folks say and things that Carlyle said that anybody who'd read both would notice. But Yarvin and other members of the dark Enlightenment actually self-consciously see themselves as following in the footsteps of Thomas Carlyle. His name, probably more than any other, comes up as one of their most important intellectual precursors. So how did that happen, right? So Carlyle is quite well known for his prose writing. Most of it's fairly unpolitical, but there's an incident. There's something that happened in the latter part of the 19th century that set in motion a very interesting series of events that'll provide some context for why Carlyle is up here on the screen and why he has such a grumpy look on his face. 1865, there was a riot in Morant Bay, Jamaica, a riot which eventually led to a kind of rebellion against the system of colonial rule that the British still had in place. So Jamaica was a slave colony up to the early part of the 19th century. Then the slaves were freed, but even after the slaves were freed, it was a very iniquitous society. Whites still controlled most positions of power in society and treated the native Jamaicans quite unfairly. In response to this riot and possible insurrection that was to follow the riot, the British Governor Edward Eyre cracked down very hard on the native Jamaicans. He sent in the army to Morin Bay and killed a lot of people. He would find people who he suspected were involved in the insurrection. He would have a 2-minute trial, and then he would hang them up with barbed wire from a nearby tree. And well over 1,000 people were killed. Many homes were burned. It was a terrible event in Jamaican history. And there's a terrible event, but there's a fantastic story to it. If you ever want to read the history of the Morin Bay Rebellion, it's an amazing story. There's all sorts of heroes and villains involved in it that I don't have time to go into now. But what's interesting for my purposes here is the English response to these events. So back in England, after Eyre committed his atrocities, a number of individuals launched an investigation, essentially a private investigation into the conduct of Governor Eyre, because the British government wasn't going to do anything about it. The British government was basically going to slap him on the wrist and say, don't do that again, but no real consequences to his actions. A lot of people weren't happy with that. And so a private committee was formed, led by John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher, and populated with just some amazing names. Essentially, all the major English liberals, broadly speaking, of the day. So John Bright was on this committee, Charles Darwin, Thomas Huxley, Herbert Spencer, A.V. Dicey, all were members of the so-called Jamaica Committee constructed to investigate the activities of Governor Eyre. There's a great story about how that went too, but again, the interesting point for my purposes here is the committee that formed in response to the Jamaica Committee, namely the Governor Eyre Defense Fund, devoted to defending Thomas Carlyle against these charges, and that was headed by none other than Thomas Carlyle. Also, interestingly, a bunch of English lit folks. John Ruskin was on there, Charles Dickens was on there, Alfred Tennyson was on there. An interesting group. But Carlyle was one of the most vocal of the bunch. And he wrote an essay, this is actually before the Morin Bay Rebellion. He wrote an essay, quite a horrifying essay really, called An Occasional Discourse on the Negro Question, about the situation in Jamaica, in which he referred to the native Jamaicans as indolent two-legged cattle. His problem with the Jamaicans was they weren't growing spices. He wanted them to grow spices like cinnamon because that's what the foreign trade was demanding. And instead the Jamaicans were growing pumpkins. And this really irritated Carlyle because he didn't see what the point of pumpkins was. Sure, the Jamaicans liked to eat them and they enjoyed them and it gave them pleasure, but for Carlyle, as we'll see, actually for deep philosophical reasons, that wasn't terribly important. So he wanted them to grow spices, they weren't, they were lazy, two-legged cattle. Market forces couldn't be relied upon to get them to grow what was, in Carlyle's view, productive. So he said, well, maybe we basically need to reinstitute slavery. If they won't do what they're supposed to do by themselves, then with beneficent whip, since other methods avail not, we'll simply have to compel him to work. Was Carlyle's view. That wasn't an aberration on Carlyle's view. He wrote a number of other things that expressed similar views. And the most striking thing about that essay on the Negro question is the racism, right? That's the thing that jumps up and hit you in the face if you read that piece. And that certainly was a strong element of Carlyle's view. But the racism was actually a particular manifestation of a much broader authoritarianism in Carlyle. Right? So yes, he wanted to enslave the black Jamaicans because they weren't doing what they were supposed to do, But he actually wanted to enslave a whole bunch of people, including a bunch of white Englanders who also, in Carlyle's mind, weren't doing what they were supposed to do. So he thought a bunch of English people were lazy too and made soft by commercial society. And so he thought, well, maybe we need to re-enslave these people too, or enslave these people too, to get them to do what they're supposed to do. And if we can't do slavery like right away, maybe we can at least seriously, this is an idea he proposed in the book, maybe we can at least like have them do like mandatory marches in the quad, right? Like, so we'll just get them out doing drills, and that will kind of instill in them a respect for order and authority of the sort that is sorely lacking in our society, and that's kind of at least a good halfway step towards slavery. So it was a full-fledged authoritarianism that had racist manifestations, but also transcended racism. And again, you see very clear this belief in a natural aristocracy and an emphasis on social order above pretty much every other possible social value you could imagine, whether that be liberty or equality or justice, and a very explicit rejection of individualism as laissez-faire. I think Carlyle saw clearly and articulated clearly in a way that later dark Enlightenment thinkers, and certainly the alt-right, have not, the tension between individualism and laissez-faire on the one hand and authority on the other hand. He saw that laissez-faire economics was destroying authority, that it had this power of what the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter would call creative destruction, that markets tear down existing sources of social power and replace them with new ones. And Carlyle hated that. Carlyle saw clearly that markets were in tension with the existing social order, that they were profoundly, to use today's language, profoundly disruptive features of society. That what markets do is they allow anybody, any upstart, to come in to a society, to start a new business, to undersell his competitors, and to put those competitors out of business, even if those competitors have been doing this for a very long time, even if they're very politically well connected, even if they're a part of this natural aristocracy. And that's something that was deeply troubling to Carlyle. And I think it's still deeply troubling to Dark Enlightenment figures and alt-right figures, although, again, as I said, I think they haven't articulated as clearly the tension between those two ideals as did Carlyle earlier. All right, so let me wrap this up early because I'm sorry we've kind of cut into your time here now, Cory, and I want to allow you plenty of time for your talk. But just in contrast to that, so John Stuart Mill wrote a response to Carlyle that had a little bit of a running debate going, and Mill's version of liberalism, just in contrast to Carlyle's authoritarianism, was a view that emphasized, first of all, individualism, right? So every individual for Mill counted, and counted equally in the moral calculus. This was one of the defining features of philosophical radicalism in the 19th century. And what counted about each individual was their happiness, right? For Mill, that was sort of the point of social order, was to allow people to live happy lives. And so the idea of work for Mill, this is something a point he makes in his response to Carlyle, the idea of work is not something that we ought to cherish for its own sake, right? There's nothing noble about going into the field and planting spices and harvesting them, right? Work in and of itself, Mill argued, is drudgery. It's toil. It's pain. It's something that if we could avoid it, right, by having robots or AI do it all for us, like, that would be a great thing for Mill. The point of work is to get something out of it at the end of the day. The point of work is to sustain your life, not the other way around. Human happiness is the ultimate moral standard. And that led Mill, that emphasis on individualism and human happiness, led Mill to a very fully fledged egalitarianism, both descriptively, he thought people were essentially equal in their capacity to achieve happiness in this world. And normatively, he thought we ought to treat people equally, and that our political systems ought to treat people equally, both economically and politically. And of course, Mill famously placed a great deal of emphasis on individual freedom as a way of kind of fleshing out this worldview and achieving human happiness. So this is just a quote from his response to Carlyle that maybe sums up all of that kind of nicely. No doctrine is more damnable, Mill wrote, than the one that says that one kind of humans are born servants to another kind. Okay, so just to wrap things up quickly, I promise, with a kind of provocative thesis here. I actually think that contemporary American conservatism, which is a profoundly hard doctrine to pin down and explain in a couple of short sentences in the way that a political theorist could explain liberalism or libertarianism or socialism. Conservatism is really hard to pin down, and I think part of the reason why that's so is because conservatism is a kind of unstable mix between Mill's liberal individualism and Carlyle's authoritarian elitism. I think it's a mix of both those views, and the ideas don't really go well together, but we've tried to cobble them together in American conservatism. And so you get these tensions erupting between, for instance, the laissez-faire economics, which conservatives profess to endorse, and nationalism, which, again, conservatives profess to endorse, right? We see these things in tension all the time. So, for instance, Trump proclaims to support the free market, to be a kind of champion of economic freedom and an opponent of government regulation, and yet he's proposing to build a giant, like centerpiece campaign issue, right? Build a giant wall between this country and the country next door to stop people and goods from crossing that border, right? To prevent precisely the free exchange and free movement of goods and services. I think it's one manifestation of a tension that runs throughout contemporary conservatism. So, even more provocative thesis, right? Perhaps one of the reasons that the alt-right has gained some traction is that in some ways it's a more consistent worldview than contemporary conservatism. Conservatism is this mixture of Carlylean elitism and Millian egalitarianism, Millian liberty and Carlylean authoritarianism, and the alt-right is just straight Carlyle. Right? It's just straight authority. There's no pretensions made about presumption in favor of individual liberty. And as deplorable as that might be, at least I find it a deplorable worldview, it's at least got consistency going for it. And that's something. That's something that some people find attractive. So I'll end there with that thesis. Again, I want to give plenty of time to Cory.
Thank you, Dr. Clack, and thank you to the whole Humanities Center staff and Dean Norton for the opportunity to think through dangerous ideas. In particular, the ability to sort of think about these across disciplinary boundaries and wrestle with them in hopes that it'll help us to sort of grow and intellectually. As I was thinking about sort of what I might sort of contribute to this sort of broader conversation, and I thought about sort of my work and particularly thinking about questions of citizenship and how race and citizenship interact with one another. And it seemed to me that there was an event that took place, relatively obscure, no one's probably heard of it, about a year ago that seemed to be relevant for how I might sort of am unpacking these ideas around citizenship and race. So let me just sort of set the stage a little bit. Picture it, Sicily, 2000. No, picture it. It's August 2016, right? Star Spangled Banner is playing, and at an NFL game, and a quarterback from the San Francisco 49ers decided not to stand. This happened throughout the course of the majority of the preseason, and when approached, and ultimately people started to notice. When approached by the press, the player articulated his actions as a stand against the ongoing phenomenon of Black Americans losing their lives during encounters with law enforcement. And these encounters and these events were made sort of more high profile by the Black Lives Matter movement. And he said, "To me, this is bigger than football, and it would be selfish on my part to look the other way. There are bodies in the street and people getting paid leave and getting away with murder." Upon learning that his actions may be deemed disrespectful to the troops, he decided to kneel rather than sit. And I'll talk a little bit more about, in just a little bit, about sort of how that change took place. Like-minded players on his team and across the league and across sports, the major sports in the United States, began to sort of take similar kinds of actions. Eventually, the players gained the attention of our current president, and he expressed his disdain for the events, for these actions, and considered them to be quite unpatriotic. The player, obviously, that I'm talking about is Colin Kaepernick. And you might be wondering, obviously this guy has no clue what the word obscure means. But it is important to sort of, I want to sort of think through what Colin Kaepernick did and what his actions have prompted. In so doing, I don't necessarily want to litigate the particulars of what sort of each player has said and the presidential, what the president has done via Twitter, and that's not necessarily the project that I want to sort of undertake here or sort of enter into conversation. But I would like us to think about sort of, one, the extent to which this forum is one that we can conceptualize as political, and that being a sporting event. Why we would consider it to be political. Some would say, and in fact many did say, sort of in response, that keep my sports out of politics and keep my politics out of sports. I want no parts of it. This is highly unusual, and frankly, it has made me like the game less. And so there's been this sort of ongoing narrative about that, and so I want to speak to that a little bit. But then I also want to sort of look specifically at his action, and talk a little bit about sort of how we might sort of think about his action as consistent with sort of a larger project, in particularly in American history, that various black leaders have taken up to sort of bring light to issues of racial injustice, right? So I want to do those two things. And these are sort of ideas that I've been playing with, and I really hope that you will sort of come with me on this little bit of ride, a little short ride, and sort of give me your thoughts as to sort of how you're thinking about these relationships. But before I go on, it's important that I sort of highlight that I am thinking about this in the sort of through the lens of citizenship, which for some might seem weird. Why talk about citizenship? There's no point that we've heard Colin Kaepernick talk about immigration policy. No one is suggesting immigration reform, and so the idea that we're talking about citizenship may seem a little uneasy. So I want to sort of highlight that I am framing these ideas around citizenship largely because I think this terrain is very useful. It's useful for us to be able to understand diverse movements for political inclusion. And it's important to note that these ideas or this protest is taking place during a specific moment, and it's during the national anthem. And this is not an accident. This is not an attempt to sort of just say, this is when I might get the most shine, but this is a commentary on what it means to be American, right? And how that has been, to offer a problematic version of that, right? Those who sort of conceptualize citizenship through the lens of political theory think about this. Oftentimes, you can sort of different veins of sort of literature on citizenship. Folks talk about it in terms of rights, right? Legal status. Being a citizen means that I get access to certain kinds of rights, social, political, civic, right? Others talk about it in terms of responsibilities. You are a good citizen if you are participating in the system, right? That is what it means to be a citizen. And still yet others sort of rest their sort of analysis of what it means to be a citizen in the ideas of membership, right? Membership and belonging to a nation state and what that's supposed to mean, how that is supposed to feel, and how that is a part of your identity, right? In that vein, it's important to note historically, and this is no surprise, I'm sure, to this audience, that legal status and citizenship, sort of as properly understood through sort of the lens of government rights, doesn't necessarily align with the experience, with membership and full belonging in a nation state, right? And that has been the history that we've seen, particularly for people of color in the United States. Sports has had something to show us in this regard as well. In fact, where we see sort of disconnects between ideas around citizenship and representation of the nation, and who deserves and can represent the nation, has been a contested issue, right? In the way of sports, we've seen strains of protests that have been quite symbolic, right, and others that have been substantive. If we think about the sort of more symbolic claims, right? Oh, I forgot I have my slides here. Okay. All right. Okay. That's the guy. That's the guy, right? So, as we think about sports as political, all right, we can think about sort of the symbolic protests first, and I sort of want to highlight some of those. Claims frequently miss the political nature of sports historically and in the contemporary moment. Athletes are and have been active in advancing and undermining ideological and political projects, both symbolically and substantively, for a long time. I might offer into evidence the dramatic victories of African-American sprinter Jesse Owens at the Berlin Olympics. They were so powerful, his wins in the face of Adolf Hitler, right, that he couldn't stand such visible repudiation of Aryan superiority and, in consequence, a fundamental part of the Nazi ideological project. Similarly, white crowds did not attack Jackie Robinson because they could not bear to see him hit a baseball or run the bases, but because his activities challenged the very ideology of white supremacy that justified the maintenance of Jim Crow and other forms of second-class citizenship for blacks in the United States. On soccer fields across the world, but particularly in Europe, in an earlier piece, Mark Sawyer and I have highlighted the extent to which black athletes in nations with ideologies of white supremacy challenge these nations and also challenge notions of who national or local teams can represent. Right? So fissures between who should represent a specific locality and who is on the field produces powerful racist taunts that include monkey chants, the use of the N-word, various objects being thrown at players. So I'll come to this in a second, but I wanted to provide this as an example, a sort of more recent example, sort of the idea that these sort of sporting events, right, are supposed to be representative. Who is on the field is supposed to represent the nation, not just in terms of the flags that they wear and the uniforms that they wear, but rather also in terms of their skin color and how they look, ethnically or racially. And so across Europe, we've seen, this is actually at a game in Turkey, where after a sort of scintillating bout, this team was losing, and their fans started bringing out bananas to sort of demonstrate their sort of disgust for the fact that black players were scoring goals against them. Began throwing them on the field, but this is just one of many cases, right? So we see sports here being a site where ideas about nationality, national citizenship, and national membership is actually being contested, right? It is their transgression of boundaries of citizenship, ideologies of white supremacy, and notions of homogenous communities that create the friction around sporting contests. In many cases, we embody things. As symbols of nations or countries, we often allow the bodies of individual human beings to represent ideals, nations, and lands that transcend the limits of individual corporal existence. Athletes who are of different races face profound questions about their worthiness to represent the entire body. Moreover, fans sometimes either lament the lack of representativeness of their athletes or laud how their team racially reflects the body politic and their notion of how a citizen of their country or locality is supposed to look. Still yet, we can think about these sort of symbolic moments, but they are not the only places where we see athletes playing a role in sort of how we understand the nation state. By now, many of us, in addition to the sort of Kaepernick protests, we've come to know the 1968 medal stand protests of John Carlos and Tommy Smith, right? Sports have had a huge influence. Muhammad Ali's resistance and resistance to sort of being drafted in the Vietnam War, it's being stripped of his titles. All of these sort of are evidence of the high-profile nature of athletes as having something to say and being a important part of the conversation around political membership, citizenship, and the nation. But yet, all of these aside, so I want to make sure that we're clear that what Kaepernick did is not an isolated case in terms of sports having something to say about politics. But having lifted up the form of Kaepernick's protest and the need for us to recognize sporting events as sites of political contestation, I'd like to turn my attention towards the function of his protest and suggest that we think about his actions in conversation with sort of historical projects of racial justice. So I want to sort of set the stage for sort of that change that he made from sitting to kneeling, and sort of how we might sort of come to think about that. Beginning the 2016 season, Kaepernick sat on the bench during the national anthem, gaining him significant attention, especially in light of the final preseason game of that year on September 1. During that game, the final preseason game, he was supposed to come to a sort of a little town in Southern California to play a team that I don't like to talk about. But for the sake of clarity, and so that we're all on the same page, we'll call them the San Diego Chargers. Right? This was noteworthy because it was salute to the military night, right? Replete with a local Marine band, skydivers, a large flag that was unveiled before the national anthem. The anthem was sung by Petty Officer First Class Stephen Powell, who also sang God Bless America between third and fourth quarters, right? So this was a noteworthy occasion. And as all eyes were sort of on Kaepernick on the sidelines, rather than sit during the national anthem, he did something different. He kneeled. This shift was the result of Kaepernick's conversation with his invited guest during that game, and a former member of the Army's Green Berets, Nate Boyer. After the game, he restated his reasoning, right, as to why he was kneeling or protesting during the anthem. And he stated, once again, I am not anti-American. I love America. I love people. That's why I'm doing this. I want to help make America better. I think having these conversations helps everybody have a better understanding of where everybody is from. Now, in considering Kaepernick's decision to sit and then to kneel, I must confess that I was deeply intrigued. I was intrigued because it seems to be a contradiction to kneel in protest. Protesting is an objection. It's a sort of showing of disapproval. When you so I'm a big fan of like Law and Order, right? And like these sort of crime dramas, right? I see some of my students in the crowd laughing at me because I talk about it way too often, right? But I'm a big fan of these things, and you know when the prosecution is adamantly badgering the witness, and the defense attorney stands up and says, "I object." Right? Gets on his feet. Right? Our understanding of objection is to stand. You stand when you protest. Right? You don't kneel. Right? I've heard people say, "I'm putting my foot down. This is the final straw." I've never heard someone say, "I'm putting my knee down." Right? It seems odd. It is what we do. When we kneel is what we do when we are most profoundly deferential. It is what we do when we are being most submissive. And as a Catholic institution, we are very familiar with sort of what it means to kneel and the power that you give and the deference that you give when you kneel. I was really sort of interested and intrigued by this, and I was struck by a sort of long-standing tradition in African American political thought, in particular, that ties objection and, in particular, indignation with deep and profound deference, and the need to do that, right? The need to connect a sort of deferential position towards the nation state with sort of ideas that I've had enough. That's powerful. And so I sort of, in particular, there is a speech that sort of exemplifies this, but it's not the only one. And it is one that many people in this room may be sort of familiar with, and it's Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." All right. I don't know if you have come to read it, but you were supposed to have had it here today. No, I'm just kidding. Hopefully you're read up. This speech is particularly sort of evidential of this sort of trend for African American political thinkers, particularly those of the classical liberal, sort of not classical liberal, but in the classical liberal strain, but what Michael Dawson calls radical egalitarians. All right. The idea that you are deeply connected to the nation state, but that the nation state has severely been inadequate in its ability to sort of do what it said it was supposed to do, right? In this speech, which Frederick Douglass gives in celebration of the 4th of July at Corinthian Hall in front of a predominantly white audience, he comes before his audience and he first starts out by talking about himself as a lowly former slave, not worthy of neither this audience, nor the occasion, nor celebration that is before him. In particular, not worthy of the podium. He talks about his embarrassment, right, and his true sort of feeling of inadequacy stepping before the stage. He makes that move, and then he turns into a tone of righteous, what Cornel West and others would call righteous indignation. He talks about the founding fathers, and he talks about where this country has been and why this is an appropriate day to celebrate it being the 4th of July. And then immediately, while he's doing that, he is always referencing the Day of Independence as yours, not mine. I know many of this is familiar to some of you, right? This is your day of independence, not mine. For me, I had to escape slavery. For thousands of people across this land, they are in chains. They are not able to sort of speak about their own independence because you as a nation have said, this is your Independence Day, not mine. He is absolutely brutal, and I really do encourage you to read it because it is one of the most moving pieces or orations that I've sort of had the pleasure to sort of sit down with and really think through. But he is brutal in his chastisement of the nation. But what he does is to say, I want you to make no mistake. The Constitution is not the government, right? The government and the Constitution are two different things. And I deplore what the government has done. In fact, he goes a step further. I also deplore what the American church has done in defense of slavery as an institution, passed act after act, in particular the Fugitive Slave Act, to say that this is not just a thing that you can cast off on the South. You have nationalized this abysmal event, this abysmal practice, and said this is ours, at the same time while you say that you're celebrating your independence. How dare you have me come before you this day and talk about Independence Day? That being said, he then sort of defers and talks about, but let me be clear, the government and you are not the Constitution, are not the Declaration of Independence, are not the ideals that we consider to be valuable, not the ideals that I, even as someone who had to escape slavery to be here, that I also hold on to and believe that in it lies hope. Much of the people who sort of have decried Colin Kaepernick have sort of suggested, if you don't like it, get out. If you don't like it, this is our country and you love it or you leave it. But I am thinking through sort of his protest and the protest of many others as this simultaneously protest in kneeling as sort of making an important distinction between Constitution and government, between principles and practices, and one that needs to sort of be reiterated and one that doesn't oftentimes get lifted up because we sort of harp on the sort of moment, right? The moment as a need for us to sort of be uncritical. But when I'm thinking about sort of dangerous ideas and how Colin Kaepernick has sort of come to sort of represent a dangerous idea, I think it's important that we sort of make those distinctions and continue to sort of be critical about the kinds of claims that he is making about the nation state. That's it.
My question is for Dr. Zwolinski. Sure. So do you think that the advent of the internet, I think you mentioned like Twitter and Donald Trump a few times, but do you think the advent of Twitter and like a lot of internet media sites like Breitbart, do you think they've helped to fuel the rise of the alt-right? Because like you said, like a lot of these writers, especially in the Dark Enlightenment, were like relatively obscure. So do you think like, because now we have this mass media platform that anyone can say whatever they want, it's kind of helped to propagate these ideas?
Yeah, sure, without a doubt. I mean, that's, I think, part of a broader phenomenon in which any sort of minority viewpoint can both find a larger audience thanks to the internet, and also find other proponents of the same idea, right? So, and that's can be good or bad depending on the particular case, right? So I think in the alt-right you have people who find like-minded fellow travelers and form communities, form Reddit subreddits, or go on 4chan with each other. You also find, I think with various political minorities, sexual minorities, I think like a lot of gay people who grew up in small towns find a lot of comfort in the fact that they can find a community, a virtual community outside of their physical locality through the internet and communicate with them. Spread a message too, but also often it's just about communicating and trading ideas. So I think that's a fairly broad phenomenon that has played a role, I'm sure, in coalescing and amplifying the ideas of the alt-right, but it's done that in a lot of other venues as well.
Do you think it should be like regulated? Because I know like websites like Twitter are like trying to cut down on like hate speech, and a lot of the things that they do say are extremely hateful, but do you think that kind of edges too close to like censorship?
I'm fairly absolutist on freedom of expression. I think if you're not articulating an actual threat to an actual person or group of persons, then you should be free free at least from government regulation, and what's now essentially a kind of quasi-public utility like Twitter regulation to say what you want, and then be subject to the marketplace of ideas. Other people should be able to respond to you and censor you, or not censor you, but censure you, object to what you're saying and argue against you.
I'm intrigued by the presence of the sports arena as a place in which one demonstrates citizenship or fails to demonstrate it. And I like your point about representation there. I'm curious if either you or Matt thinks that there's some kind of parallel between what we see being sort of played out in the theater of the NFL about citizenship and what's going on in the alt-right. The kind of consistency that you were talking about, the ideological consistency that seems to have a special place, I guess, in chat rooms or something. How that differs or is like the NFL as a place for us to kind of all get together and try to perform what we think we are when we're citizens.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if you want to speak to sort of the extent to which alt-right is active in those spaces, because I that part of it I don't know. But I can say that I do think I don't know, and I would not sort of venture to argue that there's a sort of ideological sort of clear argument there, right? That there isn't a sense that everyone who opposes what he did are sort of saying, no, it's because we sort of think through this sort of ideological lens. I think it's sort of far less sort of structured than that. Rather, I think that there is in part due to the sort of political context, particularly over the past year or two, a resistance to sort of those types of claims that he is making, particularly in that moment. We have a significant discomfort when we start talking about sort of ongoing racial injustice and what that means for the identity of the nation. There are those, and Ta-Nehisi Coates, which is this year's Just Read book, right? And he has written extensively on the extent to which we haven't even really talked about the past, much less the present. And so when you sort of start combining, at least in a moment, arguments for sort of correcting racial injustice with the anthem, they don't bode well for one another, for convincing a sort of broad swath of the American public, unfortunately.
I think most people find talking about the past much more comfortable than talking about the present, right? Like it's safe to talk about the evils of slavery because our hands are in a sense clean of that,
yeah.
right? Whereas talking about the present is much more disquieting. I mean, I don't know. That's a very interesting question. I mean, I think there's a sense in which individuals and groups who perceive, rightly or wrongly, themselves to be powerless in society will often seize upon a public stage as an opportunity to give voice to a message that they feel isn't being heard. So I think you see that, something like that going on with the Kaepernick protests, right? That's an opportunity for a message that Kaepernick felt maybe wasn't getting out there to get the public limelight for a minute. And I think to some extent you see a similar sort of thing going on with like these internet chat rooms, right? And the blogosphere is people who perceive themselves, again, rightly or wrongly, as socially marginalized in some ways, look for opportunities to thrust themselves into the public consciousness. And again, they're given that power by technology in some ways. Sometimes it's technology. Sometimes it's just there's an event, there's something happening that they can latch themselves onto, and thereby bring some light to their cause, for better or for worse.
The thing about the sort of the difference, I think, in terms of approach is that what has guided folks like Douglas and those folks who I talked about, sort of radical egalitarians, King, was the idea that if only the American public could see the inconsistency, right? If you could sort of bring it to light, right, it will sort of facilitate and help to expedite sort of corrective action in government and in policy. I'm not sure that there's a project there that in terms of sort of the alt-right that if folks could only see. It's rather a sort of a moment for us to sort of latch on in terms of a sort of internal community.
I mean, I think I really hesitate to draw parallels between Frederick Douglass and the alt-right here.
Yeah.
But
Good call.
I think so there's been this weird thing, right, where the idea of free speech has been sort of captured in some ways, or attempted to be captured by the alt-right. Like Milo Yiannopoulos has this free speech tour. And I think part of what's driving that is they think they have these ideas that if only subjected to rational scrutiny, would so clearly be seen to be correct, right? That it's only through censorship, either official censorship or the kind of more subtle censorship of public opinion, that those ideas are kept off the marketplace. There's certain things you can't talk about. There's not acceptable to talk about in polite company, and it's because we're not having the conversations that we need to have that not everybody is in the alt-right. So again, I'm not endorsing this. I'm not at all speaking on behalf of it. But I think in terms of their perception and how they see it, I think they do think that if people thought about this and we were free to have a dialogue about it, more people would come into our flock.
I had a question. You stated that the man chose to kneel. I don't know if you can answer this or not, and it's okay if you can't. Was he ever asked why he knelt?
So he describes, so he had a conversation with Nate Boyer, who was an Army Green Beret. And he had been having conversations with veterans as well as fans who were supportive of his effort. And he recognized that he recognized that there was clearly a misinterpretation of his original action as absolutely disrespectful. And there was a disrespectful of the troops in particular, which is a connection that he was never seeking to make. And so he wanted to sort of kneel as a way of sort of saying, I respect the troops, I appreciate their service, but I still am protesting sort of what we have become as a nation.
To follow up statement, I like to use inclusive language. I think if I was the campaign manager marketing for the Black Lives, I would have said all lives matter, especially Black lives, more inclusive, because everybody's life matter. I mean, that's just my own spin on it. Again, it's all about inclusion and not setting people off. Because I know type of language can be triggers. And if I was a person that had lost somebody to gang violence or something, that would really kind of set me off, you know.
So I appreciate that your thoughts, but I will say that there has been there is extensive sort of conversation about sort of what the Black Lives Matter as a sort of as a hashtag, as a movement, and as an idea seeks to accomplish. Right? Folks have made the parallels that you don't necessarily sort of highlight you don't put fire on a house that's not burning, right, is the example that's been given, right? That you are trying to sort of devote attention to where there is an issue. It's not to say that there are other issues that don't exist. It's not to say that other lives don't matter. But we want to make sure that this movement is focused on this one in particular. And it's important also to know that the idea behind Black Lives Matter and the movement, both on the national and at the chapter level across the country, is not exclusively focused on one issue, but it is seeking to address a myriad of issues that have come to affect the Black community in particular, and hoping that folks don't see it as necessarily exclusive of other movements, but rather important that this movement address these such issues.
Trigger words is what I focus on. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I understand what words do and how they trigger people and trigger emotion. So if you want them to breathe and understand and think about it, you don't want them coming from an emotional standpoint, because you're not going to get them to think about it.
So this is actually really important for sort of how we think about this sort of connection between sort of deference and indignation, at least the sort of way I'm conceptualizing it, and the ways in which movements have historically, sort of Black movements have historically tried to sort of adjust their strategies in order to sort of bring folks on board in theory and have then been pushed further, right, to do more. In this speech, Douglas says, I can hear my accusers saying, if only you would condemn less and argue more, if you would give us a more critical sort of explanation, we could get on board. And then he begins to say, how far do I need to go before you understand that slavery is wrong? How much do I need to say? How far down this line do we need to sort of go before we understand that what I'm saying you fundamentally know?
Right, exactly.
You fundamentally know it's not about sort of your comfort, you know what I mean? It's about our need to address this issue collectively. So,
Last question, Jim.
I just wanted to ask a question about kneeling, the imagery of kneeling, because it's something that football players in particular do if a player is injured, and everyone collectively collectively kneels in order to, like, kind of in reference to. So I mean, I think could you talk a little bit about this idea of reverence, that he might actually be being deferential, and how is that getting lost, especially like a right way to be a citizen, a right way to be a nationalist?
yeah. I'm sorry.
No, and I was thinking about other forms. I was thinking about other forms of protest that have come up around the same time, like die-ins, and that those are not the putting your foot down. They're not the standing up. They are, in fact, used to trigger people with imagery, right, and to make people feel a particular way. And so I wonder if you're looking at those kinds of moments, are there other moments, or do military, for example, kneel at a fallen soldier's gravesite, as an because the patriotism of military service has been co-opted in the argument against Kaepernick also.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's absolutely the project, right? This sort of idea in terms of being deferential, and what it has triggered, at least for some, is this sort of idea that it's not only it's deference and solidarity, how we might think about sort of those moments when you kneel. One of the things that I've been thinking through, and the reason why I got to sort of this moment, is placing his action in connection with sort of in what we would call respectability politics, and the need to show and demonstrate visually a lack of threat, right? How do I show you that my objection is not a threat? And in fact, everything about what you see visually is something that you should want to get on board with. And despite these sort of various efforts, not during that moment, not only during the civil rights movement, not only sort of during the abolitionist movement, there's still a sort of a pushback that nope, not enough. You need to do more. And the die-ins is a very interesting sort of phenomenon that do an interesting kind of work. Yeah. Thanks for that question.